Previously,
the dots in Pac-Man are not arcade perfect on the Atari 2600. I had to leave my Nintendo on for a week. I got so worked up about Metroid coming out. And that just changed everything for video games.
and now the conclusion.
Now, Kid Icarus, I also loved that game in a different sort of a way. It also had great music. They both had fantastic music as far as I was concerned. But the passwords were long strings of characters. O's and zeros could both be in the password, capital O's and zeros. And it was difficult to tell them apart. So when you were writing the password, you had to learn, I got to put a slash through it if it's a zero. It was really a bad design to have that many possible variables in the password. Later games simplified this. But what I didn't know at the time was that in Japan, Kid Icarus and Metroid had been Famicom Disk System games. They had save systems. Save systems exactly like The Legend of Zelda had when it came out in the United States, with a battery in the cartridge. But since it was a disk system game, it would just save your data onto the floppy disk. We didn't have a clue what was going on in Japan at this point. I didn't know there was any system called a Famicom. I assumed they had the exact Nintendo that we had, got the games at the exact same time. The way that I first learned that something was different about video games in Japan was there was a video rental store in town. Now, let me back up just a second. Video rental stores were everywhere at this point, and it wasn't Blockbuster and Hastings. It was little mom and pop stores. It was a corner in the front of a grocery store. Shops renting out space in the front of a Walmart that rented VHS tapes. And then once Nintendo got popular, they started renting Nintendo games. But one of these little mom and pop stores, I believe it was called Movie World in Ada, it was in a converted gas station. It's a real estate agency now. They somehow ended up with Super Mario Bros. 2. Now, this was before we in America had Super Mario Bros. 2. And what we call Super Mario Bros. 2 was not even a Super Mario Bros. Game at all in Japan. Super Mario 2 is what we call the Lost Levels, if you've seen it in some of the compilations here. But my friend said, hey, I was at Movie World and they had Super Mario 2. I'm like, you're full of baloney. But I went, and what they were renting was the short Famicom cartridge of Super Mario Bros. 2 with a converter to make it work on an American NES. I remember excitedly renting that, getting it home, and noticing the little differences, and then being like, oh my goodness, this is impossible. This is the most ridiculously difficult game I've ever played. And I took it back. But still, that was the first inkling I had of what was going on in Japan. I didn't know anything about the disk system there. How could I? Unless you went on vacation to Japan in the mid-80s, you would never know that this stuff was going on. So quickly, Nintendo Fun Club News changed into more of a magazine format. I didn't get the first 3 issues. I did start with the 4th issue. I believe it had Mike Tyson's Punch-Out on the cover. Here's the April and May 88 issue with the Adventure of Link on the cover. This was how we learned. This was the only source for screenshots and any kind of information on new games coming out. I would just stare at these still images, dreaming of this game, this sequel to The Legend of Zelda that I was going to get to play. And I haven't even spoken about The Legend of Zelda. I'm not sure what needs to be said. My intention with these videos is not to give you a history of any console or computer. It's to give you the stories of my experience with that time in the history of video games. But Zelda was something entirely different as well. Zelda had a sense of exploration and an open world that nothing on a console had really had before. You weren't really told where the dungeons were, you just stumbled on them. You could really go to them in any order, so long as you had the items you need to get to where they were. I beat the original Zelda in about a week. Then we heard about Super Mario Bros. 2, the American version. It's called Super Mario USA in Japan. And Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. I was so excited for those to come out. But this was when Nintendo, for the first time, and it was controversial, maybe there was a real chip shortage, maybe not, but this supposed chip shortage caused such an uproar and such a demand for these games near Christmas. It was unbelievable. And I remember being at school and a friend of mine saying, I saw Super Mario 2 at Walmart. I said, you're full of it. He said, no, seriously, I bought it yesterday. So I went to Walmart, we got it the next day. I was a little disappointed in Super Mario 2 simply because I beat it in like a day and a half. But it was still a great game. It just didn't have a lot of longevity like a Metroid or a Kid Icarus or a Zelda. And at that point, the price quietly jumped up to $40 for a Nintendo game. Super Mario 2 and The Adventure of Link were $40. I got The Adventure of Link for Christmas that year, and I beat it in 4 days, I think. I just played it nonstop over Christmas break. A lot of people hate on that game, but I really enjoyed it. Another weird thing happened to me at this time because there was no internet. There were no video game magazines. I sort of became known as an expert on Nintendo games around my town. Kids would call me, people I'd never met, would get my phone number from a friend. They would call my house. My parents would say, it's for you. I would answer, and some kid would be saying, hey, I was told you were good at Zelda. Can you tell me where I can find the flute? And so I would tell them that. I swear, kids would call me every day in junior high asking me how to do something on a video game or asking me to give them a password for Metroid or something like that. It was really, I was flattered. My parents thought it was hilarious, but that's not something that would happen anymore, obviously. I also always wore this jeans jacket. This is the late 80s. I had to have a sweet jeans jacket. And inside, it had pockets from the outside. Inside that was sewn up, so it was open at the top. I could perfectly fit an NES cartridge behind the pocket on the inside of the jacket on each side. So to trade games with friends, I would slip those in there. I'd meet them in the hallway, swap NES cartridges. I would carry NES games in the lining of my jeans jacket, basically, at school. I think one of the reasons that word got around that I was good at video games is because I got my name in Nintendo Power. Eventually, Nintendo moved from the Nintendo Fun Club News magazine to Nintendo Power, which was a more fully fledged magazine with more coverage, posters and freebies, things like that. And in this issue, the March-April 1989 issue of Nintendo Power, I am listed along with 7 other people, I think, and having the high score on Contra. It was the maximum score. It was a strange number. I don't know why. I'm sure a programmer could tell us exactly why, but yeah. So right here, David Rutledge. For some reason, the maximum score was 6,553,500. And that's a story for another video, how I got that score. Spoiler alert, it was not entirely on the up and up. But I took a Polaroid of it and sent it to Nintendo Power, and they put my name in the magazine. So that helped build that reputation that I had in junior high. One thing that was frustrating in the days of the NES were that it was pretty much believed that Americans did not like the same kind of games that Japanese people would like. A lot of games were strangely changed when they were brought to the US, or a lot of games weren't brought here at all. They pushed really hard to get us to like Dragon Quest, which they renamed to Dragon Warrior, and they pushed really hard on the first Final Fantasy. I loved both of those games. I completed them both. Then I didn't even know that we did not get Final Fantasy 2 or 3 here in the United States. When Final Fantasy 2 came out later on the Super Nintendo, I didn't know it was actually Final Fantasy 4 until quite a bit later. I don't know, they might have been right. We may not have been ready. JRPGs were a hard sell early on. But of course, you know how it is now. they're just as successful here, probably, at least within certain circles of people, as they are in Japan. You can see behind me my collection of NES games. I've got more NES games than for any other system. There are more games for that system that I would consider great. And I try to only collect games that I think are great. I got a few games back there that I probably got in a pile of games I bought at a garage sale that aren't really special to me. But for the most part, they're all games that I think are fantastic. Other systems came around, the TurboGrafx 16, and even the Sega Genesis. But neither of those were really able to make a dent in the established base that the NES had. The NES was so successful that it became like Xerox or Jacuzzi or Kleenex or Band-Aid. It became what people just called video games. Nintendo brought consoles back in a way that I don't think anyone really thought would be possible in the early 80s. And it wasn't until the Super Nintendo came out that the NES really had much competition in the US. But that's for another video. Thanks for watching.